Sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Whitmore's office, I kept glancing at the clock on the wall. 15 minutes early. Typical. I always showed up first, still holding on to the idea that these sessions could save us, that therapy might somehow be our way back to the life we'd let slip through our fingers. The waiting room was warm, almost too inviting, with its soft, amber lighting and shelves lined with books on communication, empathy, trust, words that felt distant lately, like relics of a language I barely remembered. I could smell that familiar, faintly herbal scent. I couldn't tell if it was from the plants lined along the windowsill or some sort of essential oil that Dr. Whitmore used in his office. Either way, it reminded me of those early days when Anne and I would spend hours talking over coffee, oblivious to the world around us. Now, every word felt forced. The silences felt thicker. When Anne had first brought up the idea of therapy, I remember feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. It was late one night, after one of our worst arguments to date, our voices low but sharp, words thrown like knives. I remember her sitting across the table, her eyes tired but determined. "Mark," she'd said, her voice almost a whisper, "don't you think it's worth a try? Don't we owe it to ourselves to at least try?" There was something raw in her voice that night, something desperate, and I clung to it, even if it was small. So, I agreed, without really knowing what I was signing up for. I thought that if she wanted to try, then maybe there was hope for us yet. Maybe she was still willing to fight for what we'd built. The door to Dr. Whitmore's office opened, and Anne walked in. She looked composed, calm, as she always did, but there was a stiffness in her shoulders I couldn't ignore. I managed a small smile, reaching out to give her hand a reassuring squeeze, but she pulled her hand back almost instinctively, giving me a quick, polite smile in return. I wanted to believe that it was just nerves, that the vulnerability of therapy made her uncomfortable. Maybe she just wasn't used to it yet. But there was a small part of me, a part that was growing harder to silence, that felt like she was slipping further and further away. When we were called into Dr. Whitmore's office, he greeted us with his usual calm presence. There was something reassuring about him. His steady gaze, his carefully chosen words, the way he seemed to understand exactly what we needed without even asking. I trusted him from the start. He was middle-aged, maybe in his mid-40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a slight gray streak at his temples that made him look both wise and approachable. His voice was soft but firm as he laid out his approach. Therapy is a journey, one that often brings up hard truths. It's uncomfortable, but I believe it can help you find clarity together. I remember nodding, feeling that familiar flicker of hope, a belief that this could be a fresh start for us. And, however, just listened quietly, her face unreadable. She was so distant, so controlled, and I wanted her to break down, to be as vulnerable as I felt. But I told myself it was just the first session. She'd come around eventually. She had to. Dr. Whitmore started with simple questions, asking each of us to talk about why we were there. I spoke first, pouring my heart out in a way I hadn't done in years. I told him about how Anne and I used to be, the long conversations, the way we used to laugh together, the quiet moments when we didn't even need words. I admitted the mistakes I'd made, the times I put work first or let stress turn me into someone unrecognizable. I was honest, maybe too honest, but I wanted him to see that I was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. I was opening up, hoping she'd do the same. When it was her turn to speak, though, her tone was distant. She talked about feeling disconnected, about how she sometimes felt unheard. Her voice was calm, almost clinical, like she was reciting facts instead of feelings. I felt a pang in my chest, an ache I couldn't quite explain. She wasn't sharing the way I was. She was holding back. But I told myself that was just Anne's way. She was always more guarded than I was. Still, a small doubt crept in, and I brushed it aside, trying to focus on the fact that we were both here in this room trying. As the session continued, I started to notice something else. Dr. Whitmore seemed particularly focused on Anne. He'd turn to her with these gentle, probing questions, his gaze lingering a little longer, his tone softening just slightly. It felt like he was putting her at ease, coaxing her out of her shell. I told myself that it was just his way of helping her open up, that maybe she needed it more than I did. After all, she was the one who'd been distant lately. the one who seemed to have drifted into her own world. But as the session wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow sidelined. I was there, speaking about my hopes, my regrets, but it was as if the focus of the room kept circling back to Anne. It was subtle, just a few extra seconds of eye contact, a slight tilt of his head when she spoke, a warmth in his tone that made me feel oddly invisible. I told myself I was overthinking it. Therapy is a process, I reminded myself. Dr. Whitmore was just doing his job, but the feeling lingered stubborn, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Toward the end of the session, Dr. Whitmore asked me to share a memory that defined my relationship with Anne. I thought back to our early days, to the road trips we used to take, just the two of us against the world. I remembered how we'd talk for hours, our laughter echoing through the car as we drove with no destination in mind. I described those days to Dr. Whitmore, my voice thick with emotion, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Anne would remember too. I looked at her, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something, a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She looked away, her face impassive, as if my words hadn't reached her at all. I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest, but I pushed it down, telling myself that progress took time. We were here. We were trying. That had to count for something, right? After the session, I suggested we grab a coffee, maybe take a walk, and unwind together. She hesitated, then agreed, but her responses were short, polite. As we sat across from each other in the cafe, I tried to bring up the session to talk about how it felt to open up like that. But she brushed it off, saying, "Let's not overanalyze, Mark. It's just the first session." Her tone was dismissive, almost irritated. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten, a tension I couldn't ignore. But I let it go. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that she just needed more time. Therapy was uncomfortable. After all, it brought up things we'd buried for years. I kept telling myself that this was just the beginning, that the walls would come down eventually. I clung to that hope, ignoring the growing distance between us, convincing myself that this was the path to healing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers, something precious and irreplaceable. And for the first time, I wondered if therapy would bring us closer or simply expose the cracks we'd been pretending weren't there. Underscore 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 underscore. I used to know every corner of her mind. Her expressions, her moods, each felt like a secret language only I understood. Now, she feels as foreign as a stranger on a train, distant and unknowable. I thought therapy would help, that these sessions would bridge the gap between us. But as the weeks go by, it feels like I'm the only one reaching across an empty chasm. Underscore 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 underscore. Anne's absences from home were starting to grow longer. I told myself it was nothing out of the ordinary, that she'd always been dedicated to her job, that her department probably was just stretched thin. But there was something about her explanations lately that felt off. She'd come home, her face flushed and hurried, saying she'd been swamped with a last-minute project or had to attend an urgent meeting. But every time she spoke, her words sounded flat, as though she were reading lines from a script. Her eyes avoided mine, and her smile, once so easy and genuine, felt forced, like she was holding back a part of herself. I started to notice these small details. At first, I brushed them off, convincing myself I was overthinking things, but the nagging suspicion grew louder each day, scratching at the back of my mind. As the weeks went by, I began to dread therapy sessions as much as I looked forward to them. Each time we sat in that office, there was an unspoken tension that hung heavy in the air, a tension I felt I was the only one noticing. Dr. Whitmore would ask questions, his gaze shifting between us, but when his attention settled on Anne, there was a softness in his expression, a slight shift in his voice that was difficult to ignore. It was subtle, so subtle that I convinced myself I was imagining it. Then there were the glances. Sometimes, as Anne spoke, Dr. Whitmore would look at her with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, as though he saw some hidden part of her that was invisible to me. And she responded to it. I'd watch her tense shoulders relax, her lips curling into a slight smile, and her entire demeanor seemed to soften under his gaze. It was as if he was unlocking pieces of her that I hadn't seen in years. I found myself torn, clinging to the idea that therapy was supposed to bring this out of her, that maybe, just maybe, this was progress. But at the same time, I couldn't help feeling like an outsider, like I was watching something private unfold between them, something that left me feeling alone in a room meant for three. The more I noticed these small exchanges, the more I started to doubt my place in this journey. Therapy was supposed to help us communicate, to rebuild trust and connection. Instead, I felt as though, and was slipping further away, her secrets becoming shadows that I couldn't quite grasp. One night, I tried to talk to her, to reach out and bridge the distance that had taken root between us. I waited until she came home from one of her late nights at work. She seemed exhausted, her shoulders sagging as she dropped her bag by the door. I offered to make her tea, a gesture that felt painfully inadequate, but was the only thing I could think to do. She accepted, her smile small and tired. As we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for one of us to speak. I cleared my throat, summoning the courage to say what I'd been rehearsing in my mind all evening. "How do you think the sessions are going?" I asked, my voice carefully casual, though every muscle in my body was tense with anticipation. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug as she looked down. "They're good, I think. I mean, it's not easy, but I feel like we're making some progress." Her voice was measured, distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her words were meant more to appease me than to reveal any real truth. I wanted to ask her if she felt the same connection I did, if she felt we were getting closer, or if she, too, was struggling with these strange undercurrents in the sessions. But something stopped me. I was afraid of the answer, afraid of hearing her confirm what I'd been feeling, that therapy was pulling her further away from me, not closer. The next few sessions blurred together, each one leaving me more unsettled than the last. I started paying closer attention to every detail, every small gesture, every flicker of eye contact, every sigh. There were times when Dr. Whitmore would lean forward, his gaze locked on, and as though they shared a private understanding. It was in these moments that I felt a strange tension building in my chest, a feeling I couldn't quite name, but that gnawed at me long after the session ended. One afternoon, I arrived at the office early, intending to surprise and by picking her up after work so we could go to dinner together. As I walked down the hallway, I heard soft laughter coming from Dr. Whitmore's office. Ann's laughter. It was a sound I hadn't heard in months, light and unguarded, as though she'd shed all the weight she carried at home. Curious, I moved closer, feeling guilty but unable to resist. Through the small window in the door, I could see them, Dr. Whitmore standing just a little too close to her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She was looking up at him, her face bright and open, a look I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. I felt a pang in my chest, a mix of anger, jealousy, and something darker, something that whispered that I'd lost her without even realizing it. I pulled back, my mind racing, my hands cold and trembling. I tried to shake off the image, to convince myself that it was innocent, that I was overreacting. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried to bury it, it took root, twisting and spreading in the dark corners of my mind. The next session was a blur. I could barely focus on Dr. Whitmore's questions, his voice a distant hum as I sat there, lost in a fog of confusion and suspicion. I watched them both, my eyes darting between Anne and Dr. Whitmore, searching for some clue, some sign that would confirm or dispel the gnawing doubts inside me. But they were both careful, too careful, their expressions unreadable. At home, the silence between Anne and me grew thicker, stretched thin with secrets I was too afraid to confront. Every time I looked at her, I wondered what she wasn't telling me, what truths were hiding behind her distant smiles and rehearsed explanations. I could feel her slipping away, piece by piece, until it felt like there was nothing left to hold on to. Yet, Even then, I clung to the hope that therapy was simply a difficult process, that this was just a painful middle before we found our way back to each other. But deep down, a part of me knew that something was wrong, something I couldn't ignore. It was in the way she avoided my eyes, in the way her smile felt like a stranger's. It was in the silences that stretched longer each night, silences filled with words left unspoken, with truths left hidden in the shadows. And as much as I wanted to believe that therapy would heal us, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were secrets lurking in the silence, secrets that would change everything. The late afternoon light streamed through Dr. Whitmore's office window, casting a warm, honeyed glow across the room. The gentle hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that broke the silence, and I could feel the tension building, though I didn't know why. I'd been uneasy all day, a knot of anxiety twisted tightly in my stomach. But I reminded myself that this was progress, that uncomfortable feelings were part of the process, that the tension meant we were digging into difficult territory, moving towards some sort of breakthrough. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. We'd been discussing communication, or rather, the breakdown of it. I'd been doing most of the talking, recounting the times I felt unheard, misunderstood, dismissed. I didn't want to make it about blame, but it was impossible not to point out the long silences, the clipped responses, the emotional distance that seemed to have seeped into every part of our life together. I poured out my frustrations, careful to keep my voice even, hoping she'd hear the plea beneath my words. But as I spoke and sat there, her gaze fixed on some invisible point across the room, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much, just nodding occasionally, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And then Dr. Whitmore leaned forward, his voice soft and encouraging, his focus shifting solely onto her. And he said gently, "I can see that this is difficult for you. Take your time." His hand moved toward her, resting on her shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, I assumed. But then something shifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable. His hand lingered, not in a way that would have drawn attention, but enough that I noticed, enough that it made my skin prickle with unease. It was a light touch, his fingers resting gently against her shoulder, but he held it a second too long. Just a second, but long enough for me to feel a twist of something dark and unpleasant, a warning bell ringing faintly in the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a gesture of empathy. Therapists were supposed to be warm, supportive, to create a space of safety. He was doing his job. But as I looked at him, there was something in his gaze that unsettled me. His eyes held a warmth that felt personal. Anne's reaction, the way her body seemed to relax under his touch, how her lips curved into a small, almost private smile. It didn't look like comfort. It looked like something else, something intimate. I felt a surge of heat rise in my chest, my hands clenching involuntarily. I was embarrassed by the reaction, by the irrational jealousy that bloomed inside me. This was her therapist, someone she trusted, someone we trusted. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the unease gnawed at me, twisting and spreading, filling the spaces between my ribs with a cold, hollow ache. I looked away, focusing on the beige walls, the neatly arranged bookshelves, trying to push down the irrational thoughts that had started to creep in. I was being ridiculous, I told myself. Paranoid even. Therapy was supposed to bring up emotions, make you confront uncomfortable truths. I had no reason to suspect anything, no reason to doubt Dr. Whitmore's intentions. He was a professional, trained to guide us through the messy, tangled terrain of our relationship. And Anne? She was here for the same reason I was, to make things work, to find our way back to each other. Yet, as I watched them, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was intruding on something private. There was a connection between them, a familiarity in the way they exchanged glances, the way he seemed to understand her in ways I no longer could. It was subtle, buried beneath the surface, but it was there, simmering quietly in the background, like a conversation spoken in a language I didn't know. When the session ended, I barely remembered what we talked about. The details felt foggy, as if I'd been watching from outside my own body, too distracted to absorb anything meaningful. Dr. Whitmore gave me a polite smile as we left, his face calm and reassuring. But when I glanced back at Anne, Her expression had softened, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. And for a second, it felt like I was invisible, like I didn't exist in that room with them. The drive home was quiet, the silence stretching between us like an invisible wall. I wanted to say something, to confront her about what I'd noticed, to ask her if she felt the same discomfort I did. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. I was afraid of sounding petty, paranoid, like some jealous fool grasping at straws. After all, what could I even accuse her of? A look? A touch? A feeling I couldn't even put into words? So, I kept quiet, swallowing the questions, letting them settle in my chest like stones. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, that my own insecurities were clouding my judgment. But even as I told myself these things, the doubts lingered, refusing to be silenced. That night, I lay awake, my mind replaying the scene over and over. I kept seeing Dr. Whitmore's hand on her shoulder, the way his fingers had rested there, just a second too long. I remembered the way her eyes had softened, her entire posture shifting in response to him. It felt like a betrayal, a small one, yes, but it chipped away at something vital inside me, something I couldn't name. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it didn't matter. But the truth was it did. I found myself wondering if I was losing my mind, if therapy was making me paranoid, unearthing insecurities I hadn't realized I had. I started questioning everything. Every look, every touch, every word they exchanged. I felt trapped in a maze of my own making, unsure of what was real and what was a product of my own fears. The next few sessions passed in a blur, each one leaving me more confused than the last. I felt like an outsider in my own marriage, like I was watching something unfold that I wasn't a part of. I tried to rationalize it, to remind myself that therapy was supposed to feel uncomfortable, that progress wasn't always straightforward. But with each session, the doubts grew louder, gnawing away at the edges of my mind, refusing to be ignored. And, on the other hand, seemed lighter. She no longer had the same guarded expression when she walked into Dr. Whitmore's office. There was an ease in her demeanor, a warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. And though I wanted to feel happy for her, to believe that this was a sign of healing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I began doubting my own instincts, questioning whether I was imagining things, inventing problems where there were none. After all, Dr. Whitmore was her therapist, our therapist. His job was to help us, to guide us through this difficult process. And yet, I couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that I was being pushed to the sidelines, that I was somehow irrelevant. One night, as we lay in bed, I turned to her, summoning the courage to ask the question that had been haunting me. Do you feel like we're making progress?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She was quiet for a moment, and in the darkness, I couldn't see her expression. "Yes," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I think Dr. Whitmore is helping us. I feel like I'm finding clarity." Her words should have comforted me, but instead, they felt like a blow. There was a distance in her tone, an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I wanted to ask her what she meant, what kind of clarity she was finding, but I couldn't bring myself to press her. I was afraid of what I might hear. So, I lay there in silence, my mind racing, my heart heavy with doubt. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that I was letting my insecurities get the best of me. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. And as I stared up at the ceiling, I felt a cold, hollow ache settle in my chest, an ache that whispered a truth I wasn't ready to face. Sometimes, the smallest gestures are the ones that leave the deepest wounds. That evening, as I set the table, I felt an odd sense of calm. It had been weeks since we'd had a real conversation over dinner. Weeks of coming home to short exchanges and awkward silences. But tonight, I decided to push through. I tell her I wanted us to talk. Really talk. Therapy was supposed to be helping us open up, to rebuild what we'd lost. I needed to know if she felt it was working. Maybe if we could share how we felt about the sessions, It would help us understand each other again. And came in just as I was finishing setting down the plates, looking as composed as ever. She gave me a quick, polite smile as she sat down, her eyes barely meeting mine before she unfolded her napkin and started eating. For a while, we ate in silence, the clinking of silverware and the soft ticking of the clock the only sounds in the room. I couldn't remember the last time silence felt this loud. So, I began trying to keep my voice casual, though my heart was pounding. How do you think therapy is going? Her gaze flicked up to mine, her expression unreadable. I could tell she wasn't expecting the question, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, annoyance, maybe, or something colder. But just as quickly, her expression smoothed over, replaced by the same distant calm she'd worn for weeks. It's fine, she said, her tone carefully measured, as if each word had been weighed and found sufficient. Fine? I repeated, struggling to keep the frustration out of my voice. I mean, do you feel like we're making progress? Like, we're actually working on things? She sighed, a soft, almost imperceptible exhale that sounded like impatience. She picked at her food, her gaze fixed on her plate as she answered. Mark, we've only been going for a few weeks. I don't know what you expect. Her voice was even, almost clinical, and it struck me like a slap. Okay, I know it's only been a few weeks, I replied, feeling a tightness in my throat. But I thought we'd be talking more. About us. About what's going on. For a second, she glanced up, but there was a flicker of irritation in her eyes that made me feel like I was intruding. Mark, she said quietly, therapy is a process. Not everything is going to be fixed overnight. Maybe you need to be a little more patient. The way she said it, as though I were some child impatient for results, made my chest tighten. I looked away, struggling to keep my composure. Her voice was calm, dismissive even, but there was something beneath it, an edge, a hint of defensiveness that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to push, to tell her that I wasn't asking for miracles, just a sign that she still wanted this, that she still wanted us. But as I opened my mouth to speak, she looked back down, as if the conversation was already over. I swallowed, forcing down the frustration that was building inside me. I could feel the words I wanted to say piling up in my mind, pressing against my throat, but the weight of her indifference held them back. She wasn't going to talk. I could see it in the way she turned away, the way her focus shifted back to her meal, her posture rigid and closed off. After a few minutes of strained silence, I tried again, though my voice was softer this time, more cautious. And, do you even want this to work? Do you want to save us? She finally looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I'd see something, maybe a flicker of pain, a sign that she was as invested as I was. But her eyes were distant, cold. I told you, she said, her voice flat, therapy is a process. And if you can't handle it, maybe you should think about what you really want. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to force myself to keep breathing, to keep my voice steady. What I really want, I repeated, feeling my hands clench under the table. I want us to work. I want to feel like we're fighting for this together. But right now, I feel like I'm the only one trying. She looked away, her jaw set, her fingers tensed as they gripped her fork. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. She just sat there, in silence, letting my words hang in the air between us. And in that silence, I felt something shift, something that left me feeling hollow and alone, as if a door had closed and locked between us, and I didn't know how to find the key. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch her hand, to bridge the distance that seemed to be growing by the second. But something stopped me. The look in her eyes, the way her shoulders were drawn tight, told me she didn't want me to reach out. She didn't want me to touch her. And that realization hit me harder than any argument ever could. For the rest of the meal, we barely spoke. Every time I glanced at her, she was looking away, her expression fixed in a mask of indifference that made my chest ache. I tried to tell myself it was just a rough patch, that this was just the price of therapy, that maybe we both needed time to process everything. But even as I repeated those reassurances to myself, a small, insistent voice whispered that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me, my mind racing with doubts and questions that had no answers. I kept replaying our conversation over and over, dissecting each word, each glance, searching for some clue, some hint of what had gone wrong. But all I found was silence, an empty, gnawing silence that made me feel like I was sinking. I turned to look at her, lying beside me in the dark. She was facing away, her breathing slow and steady, already lost in sleep. I reached out, my hand hovering above her shoulder, tempted to wake her, to ask her to talk, to tell me what was going on. But something in the stillness held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I was looking for, whatever answer I needed, she wasn't willing to give it to me. I lay there, my hand falling back to my side, my heart heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. I wanted to believe that therapy was helping, that this distance between us was just a temporary setback, a hurdle we'd overcome together. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping away from me, that each session was pulling her further into a place I couldn't reach. And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, a cold, unyielding thought settled over me. Maybe therapy wasn't bringing us closer. Maybe it was only exposing the distance we'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The idea had come to me on a whim, a fleeting thought that felt almost like an act of desperation. It had been weeks since I'd seen and truly smiled, weeks since I'd felt any real connection between us, and the memory of who we used to be haunted me. I missed her. I missed us. Therapy was supposed to help, but every session left me feeling emptier, further from the woman I'd once known. So, as I passed by a florist shop, the idea took hold of me. I'd surprise her, show up at Dr. Whitmore's office with flowers. Something simple, a reminder of who we'd been before all this distance set in. I picked out a bouquet of white lilies and soft pink roses. She'd always loved them, saying they reminded her of summer and fresh starts. Maybe this small gesture would remind her that I was still here, that I was willing to fight for us, that I still loved her. I paid for the flowers and headed straight to Dr. Whitmore's office, my heart pounding with anticipation. As I approached the building, I felt a flicker of nervous excitement. I imagined her surprised smile, the way her eyes might soften when she saw me waiting for her. It had been so long since I'd seen her truly smile, and I held on to that image, letting it fuel me. I checked my watch, noting that I was early. She wouldn't be expecting me. I turned the corner toward the side of the building, and that's when I saw them. Through a large window that looked into Dr. Whitmore's office, I saw Anne and him standing close, too close. They were facing each other, her eyes locked onto his, and they were laughing, a warm, familiar laugh that I hadn't heard from her in months. My steps slowed, my pulse racing as I watched them, feeling like an intruder in a moment I wasn't meant to see. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward, his face lit with a soft smile, and then, God, I can't unsee it. He reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. It was a gesture so small, so delicate, but in that moment, it felt like a lightning strike. I froze, standing on the sidewalk with the flowers in my hands, my heart pounding so loudly I thought I might be sick. They looked so comfortable, so at ease in each other's presence, like they were the only two people in the world. She was looking up at him, her face open and vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. There was an intimacy between them, something raw and unspoken that I'd missed, something that I knew in an instant wasn't meant for me anymore. I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes glued to the scene unfolding in front of me. Every logical thought slipped away, replaced by a sickening, hollow ache that filled my chest and spread to every part of me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there, watching the woman I loved lean into someone else's touch. The flowers slipped from my hand, landing on the pavement, but I barely noticed. All I could see was her smile, the way her eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen in so long. I felt something break inside me, a shattering realization that left me reeling. I wanted to turn away, to walk out of there, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the ground, my mind reeling in disbelief as I struggled to process what I was seeing. This is it, I thought. This is the truth I've been afraid to see. I don't know how long I stood there, numb and paralyzed, watching as they talked, laughed, moved together in a dance that was both painfully familiar and utterly foreign. I'd once been the one to make her smile like that, to make her laugh without inhibition. And now, watching her with him, I felt like a ghost, someone who no longer had a place in her life, in her world. The betrayal hit me in waves, each one crashing harder than the last. I tried to convince myself that it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But the look in her eyes, the way she leaned into his touch, the quiet ease between them, all of it told me otherwise. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't professional. This was something deeper, something that had been building quietly in the shadows, hidden in the silences between us. Eventually, I forced myself to turn away, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a lead blanket. My hands were shaking as I stumbled back from the window, each step feeling like it took every ounce of strength I had. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest, replaced with a hollow ache that left me gasping for breath. I staggered back toward my car, numb, barely aware of the people passing by, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly out the windshield, the bouquet of flowers lying abandoned on the pavement behind me. I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to cry, to break something, but I was frozen, trapped in a state of shock that left me unable to do anything but sit there, replaying the image over and over in my mind. I'd come here to surprise her, to show her that I still believed in us. But in the end, it was I who'd been blindsided, faced with a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. I'd been clinging to the hope that therapy would bring us back together, that we'd find a way to mend the fractures between us. But now, all I saw were lies, layers of deception hidden behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. The image of Dr. Whitmore's hand on her face, of her leaning into him with that familiar warmth, was burned into my mind, haunting me, mocking me. It was the confirmation I'd been dreading, the answer to the questions I'd been too afraid to ask. She was gone. She'd been gone long before this moment, and I'd been too blind, too trusting, too desperate to see it. Eventually, I started the car, my hands still shaking, my mind a blur of anger, pain, and disbelief. I drove home in a daze, the world passing by in a blur of color and light, my thoughts trapped in that moment, that image, that undeniable truth. When I got home, I sat in the dark, the silence pressing down on me, the weight of the betrayal settling deep in my bones. I'd come here to rekindle something, to remind her of what we used to have. But now, all I felt was a cold, unyielding emptiness, a certainty that I was no longer part of her life, no longer someone she wanted or needed. She'd moved on, found comfort in the arms of someone else, someone I'd trusted to help us heal. And as I sat there, alone in the dark, the last remnants of hope slipped away, leaving me with nothing but the hollow ache of a love that had died without my knowing. I sat alone in the dark, waiting, my mind a tangled mess of anger and heartbreak. I barely registered the sound of her key turning in the lock. When she finally walked through the door, my heart lurched, a painful reminder of everything I'd lost. She glanced at me, surprised to find me sitting there in the silence, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner. "Mark!" Her voice was uncertain, cautious. She could probably sense that something was wrong, could probably see the tension in the way I held myself. I didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch. I needed her to feel it, to feel the weight of the truth that was lodged in my chest like a jagged piece of glass. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded foreign, hoarse with the bitterness I'd been holding back. "I saw you today. With him." Her face changed, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but I saw the way her body tensed, the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice shaky. "Don't play games with me," and the anger simmered just beneath the surface, and I had to fight to keep my voice steady. "I saw you with him, laughing, standing way too close. He touched your face, and..." I saw the way you looked at him. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with something I couldn't name. Then, she shook her head, a weak attempt at denial. Mark, it's not what you think. Dr. Whitmore is just. Don't lie to me, I interrupted, the pain in my chest making it hard to breathe. I know what I saw. I want the truth, and just tell me the truth. She looked away, her hand rising to her mouth as if she could physically hold back the words. But after a long, tense silence, she seemed to deflate, her shoulders slumping as she released a shuddering breath. Fine, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You want the truth? I nodded, feeling my throat tighten, my heart bracing for what I already knew but wasn't prepared to hear. It had just happened, she said, her voice trembling, laced with guilt. I didn't plan it, Mark. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Then why? My voice cracked, the hurt slipping through despite my efforts to keep it contained. Why a man we trusted to help us? She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with tears. Because he understands me. He listens to me, Mark, in ways you haven't in years. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I had tried, that I had always been there, ready to listen, ready to fight for us. But the truth lodged in my throat, suffocating me. Maybe I hadn't seen her, hadn't really noticed her slipping away. It wasn't supposed to happen, she continued, her voice breaking. I went to therapy because I wanted to fix things with you. But somewhere along the way, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt understood. Understood. My voice was low, choked with a rage I could barely control. You went to therapy to fix us, and instead, you gave yourself to the therapist? She winced, a flash of shame crossing her face. It wasn't like that, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you. But Dr. Whitmore, he was there for me in a way you haven't been. The words sank in slowly, filling every empty space inside me with a cold, hollow ache. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand to know why she couldn't have just told me how she felt, why she couldn't have let me be the one to understand her, to listen. But I knew the answer. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped looking to me for that connection. She found it somewhere else, in someone else. So, that's it then? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You fell in love with him? She looked down, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know, she murmured. I don't know what it is. All I know is that I feel alive again. And I didn't realize how much I'd missed that. I felt my hands clench, the words sticking in my throat. I wanted to tell her how much I'd fought for us, how hard I'd tried to be everything she needed. But none of it mattered now. Nothing I said would change the truth of what she'd done, the betrayal that was now etched into every fiber of my being. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her confession hanging in the air like a bitter final note to a song I didn't recognize anymore. Underscore. The days that followed felt like a blur, a fog of confusion and hurt that clung to me, refusing to lift. I moved through life on autopilot, my mind replaying her confession over and over, each word stabbing deeper, opening wounds that felt like they would never heal. I felt betrayed, not just but by Dr. Whitmore, someone we'd trusted to help us, to guide us. Instead, he had taken advantage of our vulnerability, of my vulnerability, and used it to pull her away from me. I couldn't shake the image of them together, the intimacy in their glances, the ease with which they laughed and touched. It haunted me, filling me with a hollow ache that gnawed at me day and night. I wanted to confront Dr. Whitmore, to demand answers, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done, the trust shattered, and no confrontation could undo that. In the quiet hours alone in our house, I struggled to come to terms with everything I'd lost, not just my marriage, but the belief I'd once had in us, in love, in trust. I'd thought therapy would save us, that it would bridge the gap that had grown between us. But instead, It had exposed the depths of our loneliness, the emptiness we'd been too afraid to face. Therapy had laid our wounds bare, and instead of healing, it had torn us apart. The anger was there, a steady burn beneath the surface, but beneath it was a grief I couldn't shake. I mourned the life we'd shared, the future we'd planned, the love I believed was strong enough to withstand anything. But as the days passed, a quiet realization began to settle over me, a painful but undeniable truth. That love, that future, was gone. It had slipped away without me even realizing it, leaving behind nothing but memories and a hollow, aching silence. I knew I had to let her go. I had to accept that whatever we'd shared had been broken beyond repair, that clinging to the past would only deepen the wounds. I'd held on for so long, convinced that we could rebuild, that therapy would help us find each other again. But now, standing here in the wreckage of our life together, I could see that it was an illusion, a desperate hope that had blinded me to the truth. So one night, as I sat alone in the quiet of our empty house, I let go. I released the anger, the grief, the shattered remnants of trust that had once bound us together. I allowed myself to feel the pain, to let it wash over me like a wave, knowing that this was the final step toward healing. I realized that I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the betrayal that had broken us. All I could do was move forward, to build a life from the pieces of who I was before her, before us. As dawn broke, filling the room with soft, pale light, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was a painful peace, a quiet acceptance of the life I was now facing alone. But it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift. In the end, I knew I would carry the scars of this betrayal with me, that the memory of what we'd shared and lost would always linger. But I also knew that I would survive, that I would rebuild, and that one day I would find a way to move forward, leaving behind the ghosts of a love that had died long before I was ready to let it go.